Wind howls like a wounded animal through the desolate, snow-choked canyons of southern Colorado in the incredibly bitter, freezing winter of 1913. You are standing at the absolute epicenter of a massive, heavily fortified corporate fiefdom controlled entirely by the wealthiest and most ruthless industrial dynasty on the face of the earth, the Rockefeller family. John D. Rockefeller Jr., safely insulated in his sprawling, opulent Manhattan estate, actively dictates the agonizing daily existence of over 30,000 desperate coal miners who are trapped in a vicious, inescapable cycle of modern feudalism. These exhausted, deeply exploited men, many of whom do not even speak the same language, are forced to extract millions of tons of highly lucrative coal from unstable, lethal underground caverns, where sudden gas explosions and crushing roof collapses are a horrifying daily reality. They do not live in independent American towns. They are strictly confined to heavily guarded corporate stockades, forced to purchase overpriced, rotting food from company-owned stores using worthless corporate scrip instead of actual United States currency. When these brave laborers finally reach their absolute breaking point and demand basic human dignity, a living wage, and the fundamental right to organize under the United Mine Workers of America, the incredibly wealthy corporate elite do not negotiate. They execute a highly calculated, utterly devastating campaign of mass eviction. In the middle of a catastrophic Rocky Mountain blizzard, heavily armed corporate guards violently kick thousands of terrified men, pregnant women, and freezing children out of their company-owned shacks, dumping their meager possessions directly into the deep, unforgiving snow. Refusing to be crushed by the immense, freezing weight of the Rockefeller empire, the destitute miners execute a monumental act of working-class defiance. They hike through the treacherous, biting wind and construct a massive, sprawling tent colony on the barren plains near the tiny railroad depot of Ludlow. This fragile canvas city rapidly transforms into a thriving, highly disciplined, multi-ethnic democratic stronghold, a beautiful, undeniable testament to human solidarity in the face of insurmountable corporate cruelty. But the wealthy industrial billionaires cannot tolerate this blatant display of independence. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, backed by the infinite financial resources of the Rockefeller Syndicate, immediately unleashes a terrifying, heavily militarized campaign of psychological and physical torture against the freezing families. They hire the notorious Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, an elite, heavily armed private mercenary death squad explicitly known for their brutal, unrestrained violence against organized labor. These highly paid corporate hitmen actively terrorize the canvas city day and night. They construct a horrifying, custom-built armored train car heavily plated with thick steel, mount a devastating, rapid-fire military machine gun to its roof, and chillingly christen it the Death Special. Under the dark cover of night, the mercenaries deliberately drive this armored beast slowly past the Ludlow colony, randomly unleashing massive, deafening hails of high-caliber armor-piercing ammunition directly into the fragile canvas tents where innocent families are desperately trying to sleep. Before we witness the horrific, mechanized slaughter that is about to stain the Colorado snow permanently red, you must violently confront the highly engineered, suffocating digital reality that you are currently trapped inside. The incredibly wealthy architects of our modern economic system have spent over a century aggressively sanitizing the blood-soaked history of American labor, heavily relying on a sophisticated, invisible algorithm to keep you entirely distracted by superficial outrage and meaningless entertainment. They desperately need your historical amnesia intact so you never dare to question the massive, unchecked corporate monopolies that actively dictate your modern existence. They want you totally disconnected from the profound, terrifying truth that the billionaire class has previously utilized heavy machine guns, armored vehicles, and private death squads to slaughter American citizens strictly to protect their profit margins. You possess an incredibly dangerous, absolute obligation to shatter this digital hypnosis right now. We are actively forging a massive, highly educated global battalion of truth seekers who fiercely refuse to let the agonizing sacrifices of the working class be permanently deleted by the corporate establishment. Stand up immediately. Prove you are actually paying attention to the suppressed chapters of history, and show the architects of this algorithmic pacification that we are absolutely everywhere by dropping your city and your country in the comments below to permanently map our worldwide network, and make sure they know their unquestioned control ends today. The relentless psychological warfare waged by the Baldwin-Felts mercenaries forced the striking miners to adapt with desperate, terrifying ingenuity just to keep their children alive. Knowing with absolute certainty that the thin, freezing canvas walls of their tents offered zero physical protection against the heavy armor-piercing rounds of the death special, the terrified fathers used pickaxes and bare hands to aggressively claw deep into the rock-hard, frozen Colorado earth. Directly beneath the wooden floorboards of their fragile homes, they manually excavated massive subterranean cellars, dark, freezing dirt bunkers where pregnant women and young children were forced to frantically hide in pitch-black silence every single time the terrifying mechanical roar of the armored train echoed through the canyon. It was a staggering, deeply humiliating reality. American citizens, whose agonizing daily labor actively fueled the greatest industrial expansion in human history, were literally forced to burrow into the frozen mud like hunted animals, simply to survive the night without being violently shredded by corporate machine gun fire. Despite this unimaginable terror, the multiracial coalition of miners held their ground, refusing to surrender their union cards or crawl back into the suffocating, lethal darkness of the Rockefeller mines. As the brutal winter dragged on and the heavily armed skirmishes in the snow-choked canyons violently intensified, the deeply corrupt political establishment of Colorado executed a monumental betrayal against the working class. The governor, bowing under immense financial and political pressure from the incredibly wealthy coal syndicate, deployed the state National Guard to the strike zone under the thin, fabricated guise of restoring public order. When the massive military trains first arrived at the depot, the exhausted, freezing miners actually stepped out of their tents and cheered, genuinely believing that the government had finally intervened to protect them from the psychotic corporate hitmen. But the devastating reality of the occupation was immediate and absolute. The state of Colorado was essentially bankrupt, and the immensely wealthy mine operators quietly stepped into the shadows to privately fund the military deployment. John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his corporate allies actively paid the daily wages of the uniformed soldiers, effectively purchasing an entire state militia and instantly transforming them from public servants into a heavily armed, state-sanctioned extension of their own private mercenary army. The National Guard was completely corrupted, operating entirely as a violent proxy force strictly dedicated to crushing the strike and protecting the billionaires' profit margins. The uniformed soldiers immediately turned their high-powered military rifles against the very citizens they were sworn by the Constitution to protect. They ruthlessly beat striking workers in the dirt streets, violently arrested brilliant union organizers without a single legal charge, and aggressively escorted heavily armed trains filled with desperate scab laborers directly past the starving families of the canvas city. The Ludlow tent colony was completely surrounded, locked in a suffocating, heavily militarized siege that systematically cut off their access to critical medical supplies and food. The military commanders actively encouraged their soldiers to taunt the starving women and mock the freezing children, intentionally escalating the psychological terror to force a violent confrontation. They actively recruited the most violent, unhinged corporate mine guards directly into the National Guard ranks, slapping official state uniforms onto the exact same mercenaries who had spent the entire winter attempting to assassinate the miners, ensuring that the military force surrounding the colony was heavily populated by furious men itching for a heavily sanctioned slaughter. The unbearable, suffocating tension finally reached a catastrophic, irreversible boiling point on the crisp, sunlit morning of April 20th, 1914. The exhausted miners had just finished celebrating the Greek Orthodox Easter, a rare, fleeting moment of beautiful community joy that was about to be violently erased by mechanized corporate slaughter. Two heavily armed National Guard companies, commanded by a deeply vicious, fiercely anti-union officer named Karl Linderfelt, strategically marched out of their barracks and positioned themselves on the high, rocky ridge known as Water Tank Hill, looking directly down into the vulnerable, sprawling canvas city. They aggressively unbolted a massive, devastating weapon of mass destruction, a rapid-fire military machine gun capable of firing hundreds of heavy rounds per minute, and coldly locked the heavy iron sights dead center on the fragile white tents where hundreds of innocent women and children were just waking up to face the morning sun. The trap was meticulously set. The state-sanctioned mercenaries were heavily armed, and the corporate elite were entirely prepared to drown the labor movement in a massive, unavoidable river of blood. Louis Tikas, the brilliant, fiercely beloved leader of the Greek miners, instantly recognized the catastrophic military formation taking shape on the ridge and made a desperate, heroic sprint toward the militia lines to negotiate a peaceful de-escalation. He knew with absolute certainty that if that heavy machine gun opened fire, the fragile canvas city would be transformed into an inescapable slaughterhouse within seconds. But the deeply corrupt, corporate-backed commanders on Water Tank Hill had absolutely no intention of talking. Before Tikas could secure a truce, a single, sharp gunshot cracked through the crisp morning air, its origin forever disputed, but its horrific result entirely undeniable. The state-sanctioned militia instantly unleashed a deafening, continuous mechanical roar, actively pointing the heavy iron barrel of the rapid-fire machine gun directly down into the sprawling sea of white tents. Thousands of heavy-caliber, armor-piercing rounds rained down into the valley, violently shredding the thin canvas, shattering wooden furniture, and violently tearing through the meager possessions of the terrified families. It was an absolutely indiscriminate, mechanized slaughter directed entirely at unarmed women, sleeping infants, and desperate, freezing children who were caught entirely out in the open. Reacting with unimaginable bravery, the heavily outgunned miners did not retreat or surrender to the overwhelming military force. They grabbed their rusted hunting rifles, hastily kissed their terrified wives, and sprinted directly into the chaotic crossfire. They actively abandoned the relative safety of the tent colony and plunged deep into the surrounding arroyos and shallow, dry riverbeds, deliberately exposing themselves to the devastating machine gun fire to aggressively draw the militia's attention away from their vulnerable families. A massive, incredibly violent firefight erupted across the Colorado plains, pitting exhausted, starving fathers with antique muskets against a heavily funded, state-sanctioned military force equipped with modern weapons of mass destruction. While the brave miners engaged in a desperate, bloody shootout in the dirt trenches, the terrified women and children frantically executed their harrowing survival plan. They crawled on their bellies through the freezing mud, dodging the relentless hail of hot lead, and violently threw themselves into the dark, suffocating subterranean cellars they had desperately carved out beneath the floorboards. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the corporate-funded military actively escalated their brutal siege from a barrage of gunfire to a highly coordinated campaign of total arson. The uniformed soldiers systematically advanced down the rocky hillsides, carrying heavy wooden torches soaked in highly volatile kerosene. They aggressively marched through the abandoned canvas city, deliberately setting the shredded tents ablaze. The dry canvas instantly ignited, creating a towering, suffocating inferno that rapidly swept through the entire colony. Thick, choking black smoke eclipsed the sun, and the devastating heat transformed the subterranean dirt cellars from protective sanctuaries into terrifying, inescapable death traps. The families hiding beneath the floorboards were suddenly trapped under a roaring roof of fire, frantically gasping for oxygen as the intense flames violently consumed all the breathable air in the dark, suffocating pits. During this apocalyptic chaos, Louis Ticus was captured by the advancing militia. Unarmed and entirely defenseless, he was dragged before Commander Karl Linderfelt, who viciously smashed the butt of his heavy military rifle directly into the Union leader's skull with such extreme force that the wooden stock physically shattered. As the bleeding, dazed hero fell to the muddy ground, the state-sanctioned mercenaries cowardly executed him, shooting him 3 times in the back and leaving his body to rot in the dirt while the working-class city burned to absolute ash around him. The massacre was not just a chaotic tragedy. It was a highly organized, heavily financed corporate extermination designed to violently remind the American working class that billionaires would rather burn innocent children alive in the dirt than sacrifice a single fraction of their total control over the industrial empire. The horrific, smoldering silence that descended upon the blackened plains of southern Colorado the following morning revealed a mechanized atrocity so profoundly devastating that the corporate establishment immediately scrambled to bury the truth under a mountain of sophisticated propaganda. Red Cross workers and frantically grieving miners, carefully navigating the still burning wooden debris and warped iron bed frames of the eradicated canvas city, made a chilling discovery that would permanently scar the American conscience and shatter the final illusions of a peaceful labor movement. Beneath the smoking ashes of the colony's designated maternity tent, hidden deep inside one of the suffocating, hand-dug dirt cellars designed to protect the most vulnerable from the corporate machine guns, they unearthed the lifeless, soot-stained bodies of 2 women and 11 young children. They had not been struck by the overwhelming hail of armor-piercing bullets. They had been brutally, agonizingly suffocated. The towering corporate-funded inferno above had actively sucked every last ounce of breathable oxygen directly out of their subterranean sanctuary, transforming their freezing hiding place into an inescapable, asphyxiating death trap. The agonizing sight of these innocent bodies, curled tightly together in the muddy darkness where they had desperately sought refuge from a billionaire's private army, instantly eradicated any remaining whisper of restraint within the exhausted labor movement. This horrific slaughter did not break the miners' spirits or force them into terrified submission. Instead, it ignited an absolutely apocalyptic, uncontrollable wave of heavily armed vengeance that rapidly escalated into the deadliest, most destructive labor war in the entire history of North America. The furious, blood-soaked rallying cry, "Remember Ludlow!" echoed through every single jagged canyon and dark mining camp in the Rocky Mountains like a catastrophic, unavoidable thunderclap. Exhausted, grieving fathers actively traded their heavy iron pickaxes for high-powered Winchester repeating rifles, spontaneously mobilizing a massive, multiracial guerrilla army of over 1,000 battle-hardened laborers who were heavily prepared to die to avenge their murdered families. They systematically marched across a massive 200-mile stretch of the Colorado coalfields, initiating a devastating 10-day campaign of total, unchecked paramilitary destruction, specifically targeting the heavily fortified infrastructure of the Rockefeller Empire. The violently grieving miners actively besieged isolated corporate outposts, engaged in massive, deeply entrenched shootouts with the remaining Baldwin-Felts mercenaries, and deliberately set roaring, unstoppable fires to massive coal tipples, expensive rail yards, and heavily guarded mine shafts. They physically overran multiple mountain towns, actively hunting down the corrupt corporate mine guards and viciously executing the heavily armed enforcers who had dared to point military weapons at their sleeping children. The entire southern half of the state was instantly transformed into a terrifying, lawless war zone, a massive working-class insurgency that the heavily outgunned, deeply corrupt state militia was entirely unable to stop. The furious redneck army was systematically dismantling the corporate empire brick by bloody brick, proving to the incredibly wealthy industrial titans that heavily armed American laborers could actually successfully wage a full-scale civil war against corporate tyranny. The sheer, unstoppable scale of the miners' armed rebellion terrified the wealthy industrial billionaires and the corrupt political elite so profoundly that the state government of Colorado essentially collapsed in absolute, paralyzing panic. Recognizing with mounting horror that his corporate-funded state militia was being actively and violently wiped out by the furious working-class army, the governor frantically flooded the telegraph lines to Washington, begging for an immediate, overwhelming federal military intervention to save the Rockefeller properties from total annihilation. President Woodrow Wilson, recognizing that a full-scale, heavily armed working-class revolution was actively succeeding on American soil and threatening to permanently destabilize the entire national economy, immediately deployed massive, heavily armed regiments of the United States Army directly to the Rocky Mountains. Only the terrifying, undeniable presence of federal troops marching into the canyons equipped with overwhelming military firepower and strict, uncompromising orders from the president to forcefully disarm every single combatant on the plains, finally convinced the exhausted, grieving miners to slowly lower their smoking rifles. They drew a hard, deeply patriotic line at firing upon the uniform of the United States federal government, reluctantly halting their devastating march of vengeance and bringing the catastrophic, blood-soaked 10 days war to a grim, deeply unresolved standstill that left the corporate power structure terrified of the working class. The federal military occupation successfully crushed the physical rebellion, but John D. Rockefeller Jr. faced an unprecedented, catastrophic public relations nightmare. The undeniable, heavily publicized reality that the wealthiest family in America had actively funded the mechanized slaughter of innocent women and children in a freezing dirt cellar threatened to permanently dismantle the entire Rockefeller dynasty. Desperate to permanently launder his deeply blood-stained legacy, the billionaire industrialist executed a brilliant, highly insidious tactical pivot that permanently altered the fundamental architecture of American society. He did not confess to the massive corporate crimes, nor did he dismantle the brutal, exploitative conditions of the company towns. Instead, he aggressively hired a man named Ivy Lee, a deeply cynical, brilliant strategist who literally invented the modern, highly weaponized public relations industry directly out of the ashes of the Ludlow colony. Lee immediately flooded the national media with highly engineered, completely fabricated corporate propaganda, aggressively reframing the horrific, state-sanctioned massacre as a tragic, unavoidable accident, and actively blaming the grieving miners for the deaths of their own children. They physically orchestrated heavily staged, deeply manipulative photo opportunities of Rockefeller visiting the Colorado coal fields, smiling for the cameras and handing out shiny silver dimes to the exact same impoverished, traumatized miners his private mercenary army had just violently terrorized. This massive, unprecedented corporate disinformation campaign successfully buried the horrifying truth of the Ludlow massacre under a suffocating mountain of engineered spin, actively teaching the billionaire class a terrifying lesson. They do not need to physically win a war against the working class if they can simply purchase the entire media apparatus and forcefully rewrite the historical narrative. This incredibly sophisticated, heavily financed manipulation of history is the exact foundational architecture of the digital matrix you are deeply embedded in today. The modern corporate titans do not need to build towering wooden stockades or deploy armored trains mounted with rapid-fire machine guns to crush your economic independence, because they have successfully constructed an invisible, algorithmic ecosystem specifically designed to keep you entirely paralyzed. They feed you a highly engineered, never-ending stream of digital noise to ensure you remain deeply divided and utterly disconnected from the profound historical truth that organized, working-class solidarity is the only mechanism capable of breaking corporate tyranny. They desperately need you staring at superficial entertainment so you never dare to investigate the massive, blood-soaked sacrifices made by the incredibly brave men and women who fought the deadliest private army on Earth with bare hands and rusted muskets in the freezing Colorado snow. You possess a profound, highly dangerous obligation to shatter this algorithmic pacification right now. Weaponize the suppressed history of the Ludlow miners to aggressively wake up the people around you. We are forging an unbreakable, highly educated global battalion of truth seekers who absolutely refuse to let the brutal sacrifices of the working class be permanently deleted by corporate media. Stand up immediately. Prove you are actually paying attention to the past and show the elite establishment that we are absolutely everywhere by dropping your city and your country in the comments below to permanently map our worldwide network and make sure they know their unquestioned control ends today.